Someone actually heard your share last week. I mean, on Wednesday, they liked it very much, but I have a mental block with this. Okay, you're good now.
Okay, good Erev Shabbos. We're continuing with part 2 in our discussion of Hanukkah. I would strongly encourage you to go to the Fairlawn Library and take out a copy of the Book of Maccabees. It's part of the apocryphal literature. It's called the first and second book. There are 4 books of Maccabees. The first 2 books are eyewitness accounts, and it gives you a different story that you may have heard before. It's worth reading. The point that I want to pick up on today is that what's important to understand, I'll repeat the point that I made on Wednesday, is that the battle that resulted in the story of Hanukkah was really a battle between what you might call Orthodox Jews and those that were looking to become assimilated. Later on, it became a battle between the Syrian Greeks and the Jews. But the original battle, the major battle, was between Jew and Jew. It was a civil war. And I told you that the kahuna had become corrupted. And what's important to know, a very important historical note, is that the Matisyahu and the Kohanim, the legitimate Kohanim, and the other traditional Jews left Yerushalayim and abandoned the Beis HaMikdash before the war with the Syrian Greeks. In other words, the assimilationist Kohanim had taken over. And at one point, according to the Book of Maccabees, by the time they had attacked, the Syrians came down to attack Yerushalayim, they were already in the mountains fighting with their co-religionists against the influence of Hellenism. Now, it's also important to note that Antiochus himself, Antiochus IV, who was the Greek ruler at this time, the Syrian Greek ruler at this time, was not really a Hellenist. He couldn't care less about Greek culture because he was an opportunist, among other things. And at this point, Greek culture was on the wane and Rome was on the horizon. So he wanted to ingratiate himself with the upcoming Roman rulers to show that he had control over Judea, because he saw that was the next opportunity. And as a result, he and his armies, and then when they attacked Jerusalem, it was already after the civil war had begun. To the point that, and there's a fascinating description in the second book of Maccabees, chapter 13, when he invaded Jerusalem, he came with Lysias, his chief advisor, and a Greek army of 110,000 infantry, 5,300 cavalry, 22 elephants, 300 chariots, and Menelaus, the assimilationist Kohen, joined them. He joined the Greek army attacking Jerusalem and goaded Antiochus on with great hypocrisy, not with any idea of saving his fatherland, but thinking he might be appointed to office. He wanted a job. And again, by the time they came down, by the time they issued their decrees, they had already left Jerusalem. The Hashmonaim, they gave the revolt leadership and direction because at this point they were just outnumbered, obviously. So they engaged in guerrilla wars to try to attack their Hellenistic compatriots as well as the Syrian Greeks. There's a lot of historical stuff here. I want to focus on there's just so much to talk about. Jason and Menelaus, the guerrilla campaign. Let's suffice it to say as follows. The campaign of Lysias and the various Greek generals, they turned the Beis HaMikdash into a pagan temple. They brought in sacred prostitutes. They defiled all the kelim in the Beis HaMikdash. And this kind of gave the Hashmonaim more impetus to rebel and to restore the Beis HaMikdash. It was a long battle. It It lasted about 2 years, from 167 BCE to 165 BCE. And it was surprise attacks, nighttime attacks, ambushes, and so forth and so on. Finally, they defeated the Syrian Greeks. And there's a beautiful depiction of it when the Greeks had left about 8 soldiers guarding the Beis Hamikdash. And the Hashmonaim were victorious in most of their battles. They're charging up the hill. The Beis Hamikdash is up on a hill. So they're charging up on a hill. These 8 guards that were watching the Beis Hamikdash, they dropped their spears and they ran away because this mob was coming up the hill to retake the Beis Hamikdash. You have a fascinating medrash called Psikta Rabasi. And Psikta Rabasi tells us, let me just read it to you. When they were victorious in the battle, they entered the Beis Hamikdash proper. They found the 8 spears that the last sentries dropped. And they made torches out of those 8 spears. And just like in the 6-day war, Hakotel biyadenu, Hamikdash biyadenu, when they were waving these torches, these 8 torches, to tell everybody below that we have recaptured the Beis Hamikdash. Based on that, the Gemara in 3 different places mentions that these 8 spears became the initial menorah. That was the first menorah. Then eventually they built it up and so forth. But the reconstituted Beis Hamikdash, the first menorah that they kindled, was made from these 8 spears, which coincidentally, according to Medrash Psikta Rabasi, is one of the reasons why Hanukkah is 8 days long. We'll get to other reasons. 8 spears, the first menorah, and when the Gemara talks about things that you cannot do, Zecher L'Mikdash, you can't build, you can't make a 7-branch menorah based on the fact that they made the menorah out of these 7 spears plus the 8th was the base. So you can't. The story is not mentioned anywhere except in Psikta Rabasi and in Megillas Tanis. Now, when did they conquer the Beis Hamikdash, the Hashmonaim? So for that, you have to look at Megillas Tanis because it doesn't make sense. I mean, if you look in, let me jump back to chapter 12 in Sefer Hashmonaim. Okay, they saw the temple desolate when they entered it. The altar was profane. The gates were burned. The courts were overgrown with plants. They tore their garments. Kriya, you have to do that. They put on sackcloth and ashes. They prayed. They prostrated themselves. And then there were cleanup battles. And then he appointed unblemished priests. What are unblemished priests? Apparently, Kohanim who were not Tameh, who were not involved in killing anybody during the battle, lovers of the Torah, and they purified the sanctuary, removed the stones of the loathsome structure, which was the lattice that they used for the sacred prostitutes. They deliberated what they should do to profane the altar. They dismantled it. They put stones away, etc. They took new stones. They built a new altar. They repaired the sanctuary. They sanctified the interior of the house and the courts. They made new sacred vessels. They brought the menorah and the altar for the incense, the shulchan, etc. And it describes all the repairs. So my question is, did this all happen in one day? Couldn't have happened in one day. It's a lot of work to clean out the Beis Hamikdash and rebuild all the kalim and re-sanctify all the kalim. It's a major construction work. So now we look to Megillas Tanis. Megillas Tanis tells us a month before Chaf Hei Kislev, on the 23rd of Cheshvan, was when Yehuda Maccabee's men began the restoration of the Beis HaMikdash. In other words, they conquered the Mikdash a month before Kislev, Chaf Hei Kislev. A few days later, when they began the repairs, they began on the 27th of Cheshvan, they began offering the Korban Todah, which is a meal sacrifice. That was easy to do. On the 3rd of Kislev, they got rid of some of the idols that were located in the area around Yerushalayim. On Chaf Hei Kislev, on the 25th of Kislev, was the day that they actually rededicated in a big party the Beis HaMikdash. The Chaf Hei Kislev is significant because 2 years before was when Apollonius and Antiochus desecrated the Beis HaMikdash. The Kohanim had already left before, as I mentioned. On Chaf Hei Kislev in 167 was when they desecrated the temple. So the rededication politically made sense to do on the exact same day it was defiled, you rededicated it. Now, they were fighting for several years. They reconquered the Beis HaMikdash, as I said, in the 23rd of Cheshvan, according to Megillas Tanis. Where Cheshvan is about a month after Sukkot. Where were they during Sukkot? They were in the hills and mountains fighting against the Syrian Greeks. They had no way to have access to the Beis HaMikdash. There was no way to celebrate Sukkot in the Beis HaMikdash. There was no karbonos. They didn't have the Lovim and Esrogim to do. I mean, they were at war. In all probability, when they rededicated the Beis HaMikdash, the first Hanukkah was a tashlumin for Sukkot. The first Hanukkah was celebrated like Sukkot. Let me read to you from Sefer Chashmonaim. So on the day in which on the day where the pagans desecrated the Beis HaMikdash, that was when they rededicated it. How did they celebrate it? V'yachogu eshmonas hayamim b'simcha kechag hasukos, like Sukkot. The first Hanukkah was celebrated like Sukkot because they remembered that a little while earlier, a month before, they were in the mountains and in the caves like wild animals. So the first Sukkot, what did they do? Ba'anfei eitz avos, with the Daled Minim. They sang praises to Hashem. They said Hallel. They had Karbonos. And they made this the celebration Shana b'Shana es hayomim ha'ele. V'chein hoya advarim b'keitz Antiochus ha'mechuna Epiphanes. And this is how it took place at the end of the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes. So we have two things now. The spears, the 8 spears that they found when they went up to the Beis HaMikdash. That's number one, for 8 days of Hanukkah. The first Hanukkah was celebrated like Sukkot, which is also 8 days long. Many Kohanim were Tameh because they fought in the war. It takes 7 days to wait for purification, then you go to mikvah on the 8th day. Another reason for 8 days. Let me ask another question. If this was a dedication of the Beis HaMikdash, why would it last 8 days? Putting aside the reasons that I already gave you. In the time when the Mishkan was dedicated, 7 days. When Shlomo built the Beis HaMikdash, first one, 7-day dedication. When Ezra built the second Beis HaMikdash, 7-day dedication. Why 8 days? So, again, I've given you several reasons already for 8 days. We'll come to the oil later. You have in Tanakh when the Assyrians vandalized the Beis Hamikdash, and the Navi had to rededicate it. That rededication took 8 days, and Yehuda Maccabee was conscious of that. In other words, Hanukkah is not dedication; it's rededication. The temple wasn't destroyed; it was just violated. So they had to rededicate it, and that's another reason for 8 days. There's a sefer called Ner Lameya, which gives 100 reasons for Hanukkah being 8 days. Many, many different reasons. And that sefer is about 200 years old. About 20 years ago, another sefer came out in Eretz Yisrael, a Hasidic sefer, that gave over 300 reasons for 8 days. Let me talk more about how it was celebrated, according to Josephus, according to many, many other sources. For many, many years, and this is based, and the Gemara verifies this too. For many, many years, Hanukkah was celebrated as a public festival. They did it every single year as a public festival, and they had lulavim and esrogim parades with torches, reminiscent of those first torches that they made when they ascended the mountain. For many, many years, Hanukkah was a public outdoor celebration, parades with torches, lulavim and esrogim and daled minim. Today, in certain Greek communities and Yemenite communities, they hang hadassim on the walls during Hanukkah to remind you that the first Hanukkah was celebrated like Sukkot. I was in Israel a number of years ago during Hanukkah, and I was in the tunnels, and I saw there's a midway in the tunnel. There's a spot that's about as close as you can get to where the Kodesh Kodashim was, and people daven there, say Tehillim there, and there was a big menorah which was lit. I think it was the second day of Hanukkah, and the very, very last candle holder in that huge menorah, somebody had put hadassim. What's the connection of hadassim to Hanukkah? Now you know. Now you know. What happened to that public celebration, and how did we get from the public celebration of Hanukkah to the indoor private celebration of Hanukkah? So there we have to put some pieces of the puzzle together. If you look at the Gemara Shabbos Chaf Aleph tells us, and not too much discussion about Hanukkah in the Gemara, it talks about the mitzvah of Hanukkah is to put the menorah outside. So Pirsum Hanes. Okay. And the Gemara then says, B'shas hasakana, if it's dangerous to put the menorah or to light candles outdoors, then you put it inside. And you put it in the doorway. You have the mezuzah on one side, and you have the menorah on the other side. Today, in certain neighborhoods, it would also be dangerous to light a menorah in the window, so you put it in the doorway opposite the mezuzah. Today, in most Jewish communities, you put it in the window, people can see it passing by. Okay. What is Shas HaSakana? Look at Rashi. Rashi quotes the Gemara in Gittin, and he tells you that in between, for a period of time in Bavel, the Persians were the rulers. And Persians, as we know, were Zoroastrians. And Zoroastrians worship fire. And the law was that in their temples, during the winter solstice, which is roughly Chaf Hei Kislev, the only place where fire is allowed to burn is in their temple. Jews were not allowed to do it. Look at Rashi and Chaf Aleph and Shabbos. So what happened? This public celebration of Hanukkah, which went on for many, many years, with lulavim and esrogim and torches and everything, became a indoor private ceremony, and that's where the Chanukiah was created. It used to be a public torchlight parade celebration, and now, because of the Persians, who didn't allow you to have public fire burning, Hanukkah was now celebrated indoors. But it wasn't clear how to do it. And they have a machlokas in the Gemara. And the Gemara says the Ikar mitzvah of Hanukkah, to remember what took place and the victory and so forth, one light, and there, by the way, is not a candle, it's a lamp, an oil lamp, ner ishu beso. Each family lights one lamp each night of Hanukkah, and you fulfill the mitzvah. That's the halacha. Hamahadrin, if you want to be super duper in your religious observance, each person in the family lights one lamp. The Hamahadrin min Hamahadrin, and those who are super duper, who don't want to go just one per person, it's a machlokas. You light either in ascending order or descending order. The first night 1, the second night 2, 3, or 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, ascending and descending order. Machlokas. So apparently the tradition was not yet fixed, because the same machlokas that took place in the first century was still going on in Bavel 300 years later. So apparently people did many different things. The main machlokas is Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai says we light in ascending order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, because Malin B'Kodesh. Each day of Hanukkah was another miracle, and we elevate when it comes to areas of kedusha, of sanctity. Beis Hillel, that's Beis Hillel. We follow Beis Hillel. But look at what Beis Shammai says. And unless you know the whole story that I just told you, you would not understand Beis Shammai and the Gemara later on that quotes him in Bavel. Beis Shammai says you light in descending order. Why? Because it corresponds to the Sukkot sacrifices. On Sukkot, when you offered karbanos, it was in descending order, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, etc. Unless you know the story in Sefer Chashmonaim, you wouldn't understand Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai clearly connects Hanukkah to Sukkot. Very important to understand that Gemara. There's so much more that we could say. I'll go one step further. The traditional story of Hanukkah, of course, is the miracle of the oil. And there are many, many questions that poskim ask about why do we celebrate for 8 days if there was enough oil for only 1 day? The miracle only lasted 7 days. That's the famous kasha of the Beis Yosef. Many, many answers. The Beis Halevi suggests, which in some way perhaps diminishes the miraculous aspect of it. He says, what did they do? They cut the wicks. They sliced the wicks into eighths. So there was a smaller flame that was the last 8 days. So it kind of diminishes the miraculous aspect. Another reason for 8 days, aside from the tomb of the Kohanim, the place where they went to get oil was a place called Tekoa. And that was a 4-day journey away with the best olives. They had pure olive oil. So 4 days there, 4 days coming back. It had to last 8 days. Others would say the miracle was only 1 day, but the rest of the thing was for the war. You know, the rabbis did not want to create heroes. And in fact, as I said on Wednesday, Yehuda Maccabee, Matisyahu, those names are not mentioned anywhere in Shas. Nowhere. Bezdin Shel Chashmonaim, the court of the Chashmonaim that punished assimilationists, that's mentioned. But the story of Hanukkah is not mentioned anywhere in terms of Sefer Chashmonaim and all the details. Where did the rabbis even know the name Matisyahu or Yehuda Maccabee? They read Sefer Chashmonaim, the first 2 books. Okay. Rav, there is so we have a number of problems understanding the story of the miracle of the oil, versus the historical Hanukkah. I don't want to get into to the polemics of it, but I will give you one interesting comment. Rav Tzvi Hirsch, a 19th century Galician Gadol, whose parish is in every Gemara. He was a scholar in the sense that he wasn't limited to rabbinical texts, but he read historical texts also. And he's the only one of the very few, that raises the problem of the Psikta Rabasi. The Gemara says a miracle took place and the oil lasted for 8 days. Psikta Rabasi says it's 8 days because of the 8 spears that they found when they ascended the mountain to the base of Mikdash. How can it be a contradiction? So he answers it in a brilliant way. And he says that the spears that formed the first menorah, which is verified in the Gemara in 3 places, the miracle took place in the spears that were made from the menorah that was made from the spears. And that's where the Pak Shemin comes in. So that's his answer to the contradiction. I won't get into the polemic of miraculous aspect, whether it was a miracle, whether they didn't want to glorify heroes. That's a political discussion I don't want to get into. But clearly, there's much more to the Hanukkah story than what you learned when you were children. There again, Beis Shammai in the Gemara clearly makes the connection between Sukkot and Hanukkah. And if you look at the text of Al Hanisim, you even there have hints that there's much more going on than a simple story that you learned as children. Bimei Matisyahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol. Now, if you look throughout Tanakh, Matisyahu's family was not one of those that were in the line to be the Kohen Gadol. Kohen, yes. Kohen Gadol, problematic. So it talks about the Malchus Yovan Harsha, but it wasn't really the Greeks that made them forget Torah. Ultimately, it was part of their decrees. But the Jews who wanted to assimilate caused the Greek government to follow up and to destroy, as I said Wednesday, the particularism of the Jewish community. To get not to study Torah, not to do bris and Shabbos, etc. Okay, so Rav Tesrivam Dantan. Okay, so they describe the battle in Al Hanisim. Mesarta Giborim biyad Chaloshim. The mighty were delivered into the hands of the weak. Now, obviously, if they defeated the Syrian Greeks, they weren't weak. The Giborim, it talks about mighty in terms of their adherence to Torah. Chaloshim, the weakness, or the assimilationist Jews whose fidelity to Torah was very weak. Rabim biyad me'atim, all right? A large number of the population became assimilationist. Tameim bi'at tahorim. Maybe that referred to the Greek army, could be. But here, look at the terminology. Rishoim biyat sadikim, v'zaydim biyat oske Torah secha. The word Russia, the word zaydim, are usually referred to irreligious Jews. Either Russia or l'shcheno Pirkei Avos, zaydim referred to rebellious, non-observant Jews, usually. And they were handed over to the hands of Oskei Torah Secha. So even in the Al Hanisim prayer, you have hints that there's a lot more going on. Again, there are a lot of fascinating books about this period. Victor Cherikover wrote a wonderful book called Hellenism and the Jews. Elias Bickerman wrote all about the Hanukkah story. Megillas Tanis is hard to get a hold of, although you can probably Google it. I'm sure you can get it via Google, Megillas Tanis, and the book of Maccabees also. But read the first 2 books of Maccabees, and it'll give you more of an appreciation that Hanukkah is not just a children's story. There's a lot more going on there. And the issues of assimilationists versus traditional Jews is still going on today in terms of this battle, this war that we're fighting. Mashiach will come when everybody is either totally religious or totally non-religious. And unfortunately, you have both forces working against each other right now. So it's a tough call. But what's most important to come out of this is, number one, it was a civil war primarily before the Greeks got involved. And number two, the first Hanukkah was celebrated like Sukkot as a Tashlumin, which is why we say Hallel, which is why we have 8 days. And the public celebration was the way it was observed for many, many, many decades, until the Persians outlawed public fire displays. The torches became the Chanukiah. The Daled Minim got lost, except in those few communities that remember the story. And Hanukkah became an indoor celebration for what was once a public parades and so forth. So those are the few takeaways that I wanted to share with you. I'm sorry if I rushed through all the sources, but I wanted to get it in to give you a proper adult understanding of what Hanukkah is all about. Okay, any questions or comments?
Shkaya, thank you so much. Have a great Shabbos.
Hey, Wally,
Yes.
if it took at least like a month after they, reclaimed the Beis Hamikdash until they made the rededication, why was there a miracle of the oil? They had a month's time to get purified oil.
Yes. So you could almost answer your own question. Again, the Gemara is trying to justify why we celebrate Hanukkah. The question that the Gemara raises in Shabbos is Al Eiza Nes Kavum, the famous Gemara called My Hanukkah. Why do we celebrate Hanukkah? Meaning, in their rabbinic understanding, what miracle took place that requires us to observe Hanukkah? Every holiday has some miraculous aspect to it. So therefore, there must have been a miracle. So what was the miracle of Hanukkah? So they recall the story. There was only, but it didn't happen that way. It didn't happen that they restored the entire temple in one day. It was a major, major renovation effort. Megillas Tanis supports that.
So why does this story that obviously didn't happen become the main reason that we're taught for Hanukkah?
So there are several, that's a very good question. And there are several very important reasons. Number one, they didn't want to make heroes out of the Hashmonaim. That's number one. Why? Because in the generations following the story of Hanukkah, the Hashmonaim are victorious. They made one major, major mistake. And they were good guys in the beginning. But when they took over not only as Kohen Gadol,
But as king also.
All right, you don't mix those two together. These are separate entities, separate jobs, separate sources of authority. And as a result of mixing together politics and religion, which is a bad mixture in any situation, the 2 generations later, the Hashmonaim became Sadducees, Tzedukim, who denied the validity of Torah Sheba'al Peh. And that caused tremendous problems to the Chachamim. And the Chachamim were not going to enshrine the Hashmonaim as good guys, even though the original Hashmonaim were. They were better than good guys. They were tzaddikim. But in previous, when power corrupts, and they took too much power unto themselves, and the grandsons of the Hashmonaim became Sadducees, and the rabbis did not want to promote them, so they left the whole story of Hanukkah out. They knew the story, they left it out, and they put in the story of the Pach Shem. I'm not saying the Pach Shem never happened. I like Tzvi Hirsch Chayes' interpretation. The miracle of the oil took place in the 8 spears. That's his way of kind of putting two together. But they clearly did not want to elevate or praise the Hashmonaim, even though they were responsible for the restoration of the Beis Hamikdash, because later on they became Tzedukim. And therefore the whole thing is left out.
Okay.
But I urge you to read the first 2 books of Maccabees. It's an eye-opener.
Wally, what was, Yossi was speaking. I couldn't hear the second. What was the second thing? They took over the being the Kohen Gadol, and what was the second?
They became king, melech, and
King.
Kohen.
Actually, Melech. Okay.
And then in 2 generations, they became totally corrupt and they became Sadducees. And the rabbis were not going to promote the Sadducees as heroes, at least the generation of the Sadducees, their ancestors. So they left out the military victory completely. They left out the other Nisim that took place. I mean, the fact that the small ragtag army of farmers and Kohanim could defeat the Syrian Greeks is itself a miracle. But they didn't want to focus on that. They wanted to focus on something that was much more divine, and certainly not to praise the Tzedukim who gave them such trouble later on. Anything else? I hope that this illustrates a new